I'd like to welcome you to another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. What we're going to be talking about today is the idea of intelligence. What is intelligence? How do we measure intelligence? And what does that measurement mean? So the first thing we should do is define what intelligence is. And in this case, because there are a lot of different definitions of what intelligence means. In this case, we're talking about your cognitive ability or your IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient. And this basically is the measure of someone's ability to reason. So basically, they're taking information that they're given, they're using logic that they possess, and they're trying to answer a question or to make a prediction of some sort. And this involves them trying to solve puzzles, recall information, and it also, unfortunately, involves how quickly you can do this. So how quick thinking are people? And that can create a sort of testing bias because there are people that are really intelligent, but they need time to process. And so if you're timing them, you may not get a true picture or a true idea of their intelligence because of this artificial measure of timing it. But we'll talk about testing bias as we get further into this video. So that is what IQ is. And we measure this in various ways. In schools, we use cognitive tests. As adults, we use IQ tests. And of course, you have to be careful about these IQ tests because you want to make sure that they're created by a credible psychologist or psychologists and that it's nationally normed. And so once you take these, you are given a number. And this is how this number looks like distributed. So this is a bell chart. And what you see here is a fairly even distribution across from one end to the other end. So for example, in the middle, about 69% or almost 70% of people fall into the range of an 85 to a 115. That is average intelligence. So a majority of people are of average intelligence. When you look at on either end of this bell curve, what you see is that you get on both sides, you get a 13.6, and this is above average intelligence. So 115 to 130 is above average, 70 to 85 is below average. And then when you get into the 2.1 and the 0.1, you're getting into, on one end of the spectrum, you're getting into gifted, and on the very far side, you're getting highly gifted. At the same time, on the other end, you're getting someone who is really cognitively low, and the very end of that are people who can barely cognitively function. So this is the way this is distributed. And so what we look at when we look at IQ tests in regards to gifted is we look at this range of the 2.1 and is where most gifted students are falling into. So they need at least a 130 to be considered gifted, and it usually goes to about 145. I don't see a lot of students that get above the 145, but if they do, they're considered highly gifted. Although that makes no difference, you're just gifted no matter what your IQ score was. But what it does do is it creates a differentiation. So if you have a student with a 130 IQ and one with a 160 IQ, that's the same as having someone with a 100 IQ and someone with a 70 IQ. You're going into different parts of this. So this is the way the distribution of intelligence works. Now, how do we arrive at this number? How do we get these magical numbers that you see at the bottom of this bell curve? And what we do is we use intelligence tests or cognitive tests. And again, you want these to be created by a reputable source and someone who, an organization that has nationally normed their test, and what nationally norms mean is that several students are taking it and then they use that distribution bell chart that I talked about before to determine where those numbers are going to lie. So what I want to show you are 3 questions you might see on a cognitive test. So this first one that you see here is trying to predict a pattern. And so what you do is you look at this particular one. You may have already figured it out, but what you do is you look at the rows. In the top row, you just have a single line of balls. In the second row, you have 2 lines of balls. And in the third one, you have 3 lines of balls. So one prediction you can make in this question mark, this blank spot, is no matter what it is, it's going to have 3 rows of balls. So that is one prediction that you can make. But you also have to take information on how this is shifting. So if you look at the top row, you get one at an angle, and then another one at the opposite angle, and then one that is horizontal. Then the horizontal on the next row moves to the end, and the one angle shifts over to the middle, and the one that was in the middle now shifts to the right. So using logic, you see that they're shifting one tile over for each row. So for example, on that bottom row, you have one that is at one angle, one that is horizontal. And so logically speaking, we're looking at something that has 3 rows of balls, and it is at the opposite angle of that first one that you see. So this is just using logic to try to determine what that might be. The second one that we're going to take a look at is this one right here. And these are ones that are which one does not belong. So in other words, we're looking at these shapes and we're trying to determine which one does not belong or does not share a common feature. So if you look at these, you have this, this X, and you have an hourglass shape. And so you have to try to figure out which one of these does not belong. So I'm going to give you a second to take a look at that. And so the answer here is B, which is the arrow. And the reason why is it's the only one that's not symmetrical. So what I mean by that, of course, is that all the shapes besides B have vertical and horizontal lines of symmetry. Shape B does not have a horizontal line of symmetry. And now, when you might look at that and you might think, oh, this is going to be A because A is the only, and you could make an argument for that, but the logic here is B is the correct answer because of those lines of symmetry. So I'll show you one more example. So here is so in addition to shapes, they also will have verbal analogies. And the verbal analogies it could be and there's also sentence completion. But the verbal analogies look like this, where you are trying to figure out logically what is the relationship here. So when we look at this particular one, and this is a fairly simple analogy, you have green is to blue, but green is to grass as blue is to what? And so you have to figure out what that relationship is. So green is the color of grass. So that's the relationship. So then you apply that same relationship to the blank one. Blue is the color of what? And so you look here, and really the only one that would be considered to be blue would be B, sky. A sky is blue. So that's what makes sense. Now, could kids make arguments that there are some blue in clouds and that rain has some blue? They could make arguments of that, but we're talking about the most logical answer, and you're trying to use predicting that logical answer. In addition to these verbal analogies, we might have what are called sentence completion. And sentence completion is just taking a sentence and trying to complete it. So we have Andrew put the shirt back in the clothes dryer as it was still what? So you have to read this question, and you have to think, why would Andrew put a shirt back in the dryer? And obviously, it's because it's probably not dry. That's the whole purpose of putting a shirt in a clothes dryer. So if he's putting it back, something didn't go right. And so the correct answer here would be A, or damp, because if it's not dry, you have to put it in and let it complete it out. Again, you can make arguments for other ones, although you could make an argument for the warm because people love warm clothes out of the dryer. I know I do. But you could say if it wasn't fresh, or but you would put that back in the washing machine, not the dryer. And you wouldn't have a shirt that's broken. Shirts don't break. They may rip, they may tear, they don't break. And so again, this is using logic to try to figure out these things. And so these are some examples of questions that you might see on a cognitive test. Now, we talked about testing bias before. The first 2 questions that I showed you were just using visuals. So it was just trying to figure out visually where the next one was. And so there doesn't take any ability to comprehend or read or things of that nature. So these are called nonverbal questions. And these tend to be less biased than ones that are verbal. Because if you use a term that seems like it's commonly known, but a student comes from a background where it's not. So for example, if you use the word sofa, if you said, they were sitting on the sofa, some people may be, what is a sofa? Because in some regions of the country, they use the word couch. Or if they're in another country, they might use, another term. And so that's knowing your vocabulary. That has nothing to do with cognitive intelligence. That has to do with your vocabulary. And so that can create a testing bias. Same thing with the analogies. If you're using terms that maybe aren't common to some people, either because of being economically disadvantaged or where they live, or maybe they're an EL student who doesn't speak English is not their primary language, it's going to create some bias. And so there are some assessments like the Naglieri, which just use patterns and pictures. And there are others like the COGAT, which do have sentence completion and analogies and things of that nature. And so you have to be careful that when you're testing students, you try to eliminate as much bias as possible. The essential question that I get asked a lot is, can you study for a cognitive test? And the reality is that you really can't study for a cognitive test. The one thing you can do is get students familiar with the formatting of the test. So for example, going back to our patterns one, if you're not understanding what it's asking you to do, because you've never seen patterns like this before, then you're going to not get the correct answer, not because you didn't know it, but because you didn't understand it. And so exposing students to a format where they are able to see how it works and then figuring that out for themselves is going to show their true intelligence. So knowing the format can be helpful, but you can't really study for a cognitive test. I'll share this anecdote. So my daughter, who scored she was a 115 IQ or cognitive score, and she got a 115 on her third grade test and a 117, I'm sorry, on her fifth grade test. And so it was going up slowly. And so I wanted to have her tested one more time just to try to see if she could get a push. And so one thing that I always tell people not to do, and I did it myself, was I went into Amazon, and there are a ton of test prep books. These, again, do not help you with cognitive tests other than showing you the format. But my daughter was going to be taking a nonverbal test, so I wanted her to be familiar with the format. So we got this book, she studied it, we looked at different patterns, and she got an understanding of how it worked, and she took the cognitive assessment, and she scored a 118. So even with all that prep and all that work, it barely moved her cognitive score. So in my experience, you're not going to see a lot of parents were asking me all the time, can they study for this? And if a cognitive test is written correctly, they should not be able to study for it. They should, because it's whether you have that ability or not. And there's always that nature versus nurture. Are you born with that, or do you develop it? And of course, like most things, it's a little bit of both. But you're not going to develop your IQ from a 115 to a 135 by studying something. That's just not going to happen. And so, because although it's not completely fixed, it can move up and down from time to time. If it is accurately assessing someone's IQ, it does end up being fairly consistent when you test people several times throughout the years. So the last thing is, does IQ matter? Because there are parents that will call me and will say, my student or my child missed it by 1 point. You're telling me that you're going to ruin their life because of this 1 point. You're not going to put them in gifted programming or whatever. And the answer is, you're not going to ruin anyone's life. I mean, gifted programming is great for gifted students, and it can work for non-gifted students as well. But if you don't get into it, there are other classes as well that offer just as good, if not better, options for students. So an IQ does not guarantee success. That is definitely for certain. There are other factors that come into play, whether it be your effort, whether it be your grit, whether it be your attitude. Those things all come into play. I can't tell you how many former students I've had who were highly intelligent, and yet when you look at them down the road, they do not experience a lot of success because they either were not hard workers, or some outside extenuating circumstances prevented them from being able to pursue what they wanted to. And at the same time, I've seen students that have just an above average, I shouldn't say just, but they have an above average intelligence, or even average intelligence sometimes, but they work their butt off. And as a result, they're going to see more success because this is what we want to see out of people. We want to see them trying. We want to see them attempting. We don't want to see them always getting it right. We want to see that they're putting some effort into that. So in the long run, IQ doesn't and cognitive tests don't matter, but they are good for trying to identify kids that should be in gifted programming, that to address those needs, just like you would a student that is on the other end of the spectrum. It's special education, and you have special instruction for them. You have certain strategies that work with them. It's the same on the gifted end. We're just trying to create a pool of students that allows us to identify kids, and then hopefully, use use strategies to keep their cognitive abilities. You're not going to change it, but you're going to keep it going and keep it fresh and keep it, where it's at.